Okay, welcome to another edition of Moments in Metal. This could turn into a Sessions in Steel because I've got a lot of different things I'm going to try and do today, all small jobs. Okay, so if you've been following in the series, you would have seen me making these brackets, and these brackets are for this piece here, and these brackets will go in behind. They've got to be welded on. I've got to do some panel beating on this to try and get out some of the ripples and cattywampus effect. In other words, it's not very straight yet. It probably looks good on the camera, but it isn't. So today it's Saturday, and I know what Saturday is. That is try and get some stuff done on my own projects today, not so much on the customer stuff. Another one that I will be tackling will be replacing the rusty bracket on this section and cutting the rust out of this. But first, I will be cutting this section out, and that is the flange that we made last week. And as promised, this first job will be taking this section off and replacing this rusty section here. So I'll be adding all of that in. This also needs some panel beating. It probably, once again, looks good on camera, but believe me, it's a little bit ripply and it needs to be sorted out. I will cut right to it, and I will make sure that we put you on time lapse once again, so you're not watching all the boring real world footage. Got the clock going in the background so you get a bit of a taste of time and how long these things take. If this seems overkill, this is not necessarily overkill. It is just part of the restoration process. You would ask the question, just go and get another mudguard that you don't have to do all this to. And notice I use the word mudguard. For my American audience, audience, is that a word? I don't think that is. Okay, we'll try and cut that bit out. Take two. For my American audience, a mudguard is a Fender. For my Australian audience, I'm sorry, a Fender is a mudguard. I'm trying to appeal to everyone here. So we'll get right to it and make it happen. I'm going to stop for smoko shortly. So this is just a setup so I can get everything ready for some filming and see how much stuff I can get done today. Rightio, let's get into it, I think. Anyhow, we'll put you on time lapse and I'll start with some panel beating. I'm going to start straightening this up. I'm going to use the shrinking disc and some hammer dolly technique just to get that nice and straight. And that should take me to smoko, which is in about 20 minutes time. Okay. We'll get there. Okay, I've been doing a little bit of work off camera. I've been straightening this out a little bit more than what you've seen in the time lapse. I simply forgot to turn the camera back on, so it wasn't a long smoko. I've got a fair bit trying to get done today. What I have been doing is, you've seen in the time lapse video, I'll be using the dolly. That's a nice sharp edge. That's curved. This is curved. Shapes go together. It's not rocket science. You don't have to try and figure out too much behind that. What I'm trying to do is, this had been accident damage. There would have been impact. This goes in behind the front bumper bar. I have a section of front bumper bar here. This is an old one, and I restore these myself. I do all the metal work. And how this panel works is You get a handful of it, and that panel goes in behind there. When this is all back together as one, that's your bottom of your mudguard, and the panel fits in like so. So it's not terribly hard to see what it is we're trying to do here. Now, although some of this is hidden, we're still going to get it straight, because any creases that are here are going to transfer through and you will see them. So I will often use second-hand bits of pieces like this bumper end, just to quickly check that I'm within QE. However, when it comes to the final tuning, I then will move to one I prepared earlier. This is a bumper section I've repaired and restored some years ago. I go through and I do all my own, and then I send them away for chrome plating. The shape here is not going to be terribly different between a repaired one and a not repaired one. However, you do need to make sure that the finished article you're aiming for on your panels will match the finished articles on your chrome work. And I can put this in here and I can see that, yes, I've got that nice and right. I keep this chrome work that's all beautiful well out of the way, so that'll get moved out of the way before I do any grinding or welding. You've seen me in the time lapse using the shrinking disc on here. I've also run this through the shrinker stretcher jaws, which you've seen in previous videos, and the shrinker stretcher jaws also help to straighten this out. Because that's that accident damage, it's all been crinkled up. Not badly, but it's been crinkled up bad enough that it's got to be repaired. So obviously, while this is all unpicked, this is the time to fix it. This is another reason I unpick all the panels and I basically remanufacture the panel in all its components all over again. So this has no bracket welded in at the moment. That's the bracket that I've made. I've got to weld that bracket in. I don't want to weld this bracket in until I've got this panel part straight. And that's why you see me moving backwards and forwards in between different jobs, but they're all related to each other. So it might look like it's a little bit out of sequence, but it isn't really. And now I've got this straight. This could be welded in here. I'll use a little bit of weld-through primer on that, weld-through primer on here. I'll clamp that in. I can use my spot welder, or I can use my TIG. I will most likely TIG this and replicate a spot weld with a TIG. The reason I do that is I know it's not going to let go. Anyhow, I'm going to now move on and carry on with the next phase. So I'm happy I've got that straight. That was my job before Smoko. It actually carried on after Smoko. And I just look for the little jobs that, you know, if it's 20 minutes to Smoko, this is a job I can do in 20 minutes. Except it wasn't 20 minutes, it was a little bit more than that. I came back and, yeah, still wasn't happy with it and did a few more refinements. Anyhow, I'll put this down and I will now go back onto time lapse and I'll cut this section out. I'll cut that section out and I'm going to prepare this and that to be one piece again. So I'll get onto that right now. Before I do, I'm going to move this somewhere where it can't get damaged.
baby. You ought to tell me so. If you don't want me, baby, you ought to tell me so. I'll get my trunk and my clothes, and out your door I'll go. Now tell me, baby, what you think of me. Well, now tell me, baby, what you think of me. You ain't been giving me no rest since I've been in Nashville, Tennessee. One more verse and I ain't gonna sing no more. I'm gonna sing one more verse and I ain't gonna sing no more. 'Cause my train is here and you know I gotta go.
Okay, I'll bring in a little bit closer and I'll show you the tacked up piece and how I've got it all shaped to fit as flush as possible when the thing focuses, and anywhere where it's a little bit out of alignment, you make sure that you left yourself enough leeway to pull the two pieces back in together. You'll notice that I stop and I'll hammer the welds, and I'll often turn it over. I'm looking for the shape on the big dolly here, and I'll turn it over and I'll hammer the weld. The reason I'm hammering the weld is so it'll stretch it back out again, and I'm pretty pleased with that. Now all those little tiny shiny marks, they're all hammers or hammer strikes, so that is to get out some of the existing damage that was still in this part from the frontal damage. I hadn't noticed it up until now. It had a bit of a slight crease through there from when the impact has transferred up to here, and if you look you can see some old grinding marks. They're not mine. I would suggest that they are actually factory, because this had never been repaired in the front ever before. It was its original factory finish. The factory would run around with a 36 grit on a 9-inch grinder and just basically deburr and shape the vehicle where they thought it was necessary. Sometimes it was unnecessary, because there's often no logical reason why they would do that in some places. Okay, now to bring you into the picture, you start at one end and you work your way through. However, that's not always going to be the golden rule. You might find that in this case I needed to put a tack here in order to bring this in a bit closer down there, and then followed through from that. That's why this has got no welding in here yet. I'm still shaping that, and as I'm striking this, it's closing up that gap. That was a bit of a substantial gap. However, I knew when I scribed it that it was going to be exactly right. And you would have seen me use the scribe. I've gone in and scribed, use a black pen so I can see where my scribe line is, and then it all gets cut out and shaped accordingly. And I shaped it as you would have seen on the using the grinder, and also on the linishing belt on the bench grinder. Okay, so from here I'm going to put you back on time lapse, and I'll continue beating and welding it until this is welded up. So what do we have for time? 20 to 4. Seems to be a weekly occurrence, this, doesn't it? I always seem to be doing exactly the same welding at exactly the same time each week. Anyhow, enough of me chatting. I'll put you back on time lapse and I'll get into it. Okay, so this, unfortunately the time-lapse didn't work because it ran out of battery, and it didn't bother telling me that it was getting low. So this is a fast forward shot to the end result. This is now all welded on and panel beaten and metal finished. There's a little tiny bit more to do just down here. So this is the section that we put the flange on last week, and now that is the section that has its rust cut out. And I'll just reach over and grab the piece that we took out. So this is the rust that I cut out. This is the new section taken from here that we repaired last week, and it's now welded into the original FE Ute lower fender section or mudguard section. So from here, I've run out of day today. It's the time, it's about 6 o'clock. It took me around about an hour and a half to 2 hours to weld that in and panel beat, probably about 2 hours. And unfortunately, even though it was filming, it did not save the film. So I don't know when it ran out of battery. I thought there was plenty of battery. Never mind. You probably don't really have to see all the time lapse, but it would have been nice for the showing the time ticking past. And here is another one, and you can see that I've got the shape and everything about right. So that's enough for today, and I will continue on tomorrow, hopefully with some charged battery in the gimbal and in the phone. So I will sign off for now, and we will start again tomorrow. Okay, Sunday morning we have Hemi helping. It is just after 9 o'clock. I've been down here just before 9 setting up and given Hemi a good scratch. Anyhow, today's focus shall be attaching the straightened out lower panel, and the bracket will go inside the lower panel here, and this will get attached to that, and that should be the culmination of today's work. And of course I'm going to have some help today. Who's a twit? No workshop is ever complete without a cat. This is Hemi. For those of you who are new to this channel, you will find that I periodically will have different cats, but in the workshop, and Hemi is my main cat. It's raining today, it's Sunday, it's quite bitterly cold. You'll probably see me rubbing my hands together, and he tolerates me working as long as I'm not throwing sparks at him. Anyhow, let's get back into it and let's make this happen, because I'd like to try and put this video out today being Sunday, because during the week I've got work to do, mostly working on the FE Holden Ute there in the shop. That's my last big customer project. Okay, let's get into it. So that is the repaired bottom flange plate welded on, baffle plate if you'd like to call it. it'll be a baffle plate because it baffles the gap between the bumper bar and the bodywork. So this will go in there like so, and that's about as much of it that is seen. What I have to do now is tidy up this end. I've left this to last purely because I will shape all that after that's welded on. You don't want to be trying to shape this before you put it on because it won't work. The next thing I shall do is pick a bracket, any bracket, probably the one that I've painted. So you'll see me using a weld-through primer, and I'll show you the can. This is the weld-through primer, the one that I use. It's by Welcome. I get that through R.A. Johnson in New Zealand. It's the only zinc-based weld-through primer I found that works. I used to use a copper weld-through primer. New Zealand has rules that say that we cannot use copper weld-through primer anymore. It's rubbish. They just decided that no, you can't use copper weld-through primer. So if we're trying to get a body repair cert on anything, we have to use a zinc weld-through primer. They just will not allow copper weld-through primers. Having said that, it was a blessing in disguise purely because a can of this is less than half of the price of a can of that. They were getting up around about $50 a can. These are around about $25 a can. And I find this works really, really well. The copper weld-through primer worked really well also, but I'm not going to get into a debate about that here. All I'm showing you is before I weld metal to metal, as in anything that's a seam or anything that's an overlap, you have to use a weld-through primer. If you're not using weld-through primers, you're going to have some problems on your hands with rust in between the panels. Now, you have seen when I've unpicked these, the rust is forever present in between the panels. That's what causes these to rust out to begin with. There is no protection in there whatsoever. The factory will sometimes dip the panels and the whole car in a primer solution. It never gets all in between the gaps. You need the primer in there first, then do the welding. The factory didn't do that because it just wasn't worth their while, and they didn't really have that technology back then either. So the importance of weld-through primers. Hopefully I've got some different footage showing you how I do the spot welding, and I'll just very quickly explain the spot welding. Anywhere that, because this is a panel we're reusing, it had drilled out spot welds. I set my TIG, in this case 92 amps, and you'll notice there's an orange light on there. That is because I have that preset for spot welding. And I press the button, goes to a green light, and that's just straight out welding. It's just 92 amps instantly. When I'm on this one, I have that ramping up and ramping down in amps, and that's about as far as I go with getting fancy with welding. Every now and then you'll see me stop and flick the torch. It may or may not show up in the time lapse. That's because I'm getting a big dob of gathering metal on the tungsten. I flick the torch while it's hot and that flicks off. When you're doing spot welding, it doesn't matter if you've got a big globule there, purely because that globule will eventually just go into your weld. You'll notice that when I'm spot welding, that anywhere that I'm not filling in a hole, it's a lot quicker and it burns right through. It's a little bit hard to show you on camera. Don't think it'll pick it up inside there. But the difference between a filled spot weld, that's a little bit lumpier because you've got some metal there, and I can just about replicate a factory spot weld purely by having my TIG set up. And I don't use the clamping spot weld gun so much anymore. I found that that's a little bit hit and miss. You never know if the spot welds have taken properly. So this is coming along pretty good. I have found I've got one tiny little pinhole there that I'm going to have to address. Keeping in mind this was a rusty panel before I started. A little bit thin in a few places, and I'll add a little bit more, possibly silicon bronze, to fix some of those areas. And this is just about done. I'll reshape that corner. I'll put this bracket on, and it's not smoko time yet, so I'll have to finish this, and hopefully I can then go and edit and upload this video today. So I'm going to crack on and put my bracket on in here, and that part will be done. Put you on time lapse, and hopefully the thing won't run out of battery again. That was a disaster yesterday. Okay, less talking, let's get into it. And yes, it is cold. there we have it. That's the end result. Is it as good as new? No, it's not as good as new, and that would be because we've done a lot of cutting and welding on it. I've had to chase my tail a little bit just in here. It was very thin. The factory had run a grinder through here, and obviously they let it rest down on this edge and it made it a little bit thin. When I've put my new edge on, that was fine. It was the metal above it that was a bit thin, so had quite a bit of a rework to do there. Did all that off camera, otherwise it's just a lot of boring footage, and I constantly would refer back to another original one, and as you can see, this just instantly you can tell that's a lot cleaner to look at than this poor old panel beaten thing. Now that's not to say this was a complete waste of time and that's a piece of junk. Far from it. We know it's rust free, we know that we've straightened it out, and we also know that we've had to patch it. So I'll show you what it looks like on the inside, and there's our bracket that I manufactured a couple of episodes ago, a few weeks ago, and all the spot welding done again. Did everything with the TIG. I don't use a MIG for anything if I can help it, and doesn't really show you much down in there. I took an approximation of, just get the light onto it, of what this corner was meant to look like, and I just copied what I could see on the other one. I have found that sometimes the factory didn't finish this very well down there, and then coupled with accident damage, I would say that that's been caught on something, probably dropping across the paddock because it was a ute this came from. And you can see here there's meant to be a join right around the corner, and I haven't got a join right around the corner. I'll often add a bit of weld down here because these often split and that becomes a problem. So some of them have been welded. This one had been welded in the factory, probably because they did a really rough job of putting that mudguard together. These things are not Rolls Royces, they're Holdens, so you're going to get a lot of discrepancies between panels. And one of the things that I must point out is what I use for welding wire. I might have misled people who've asked. I use, when it focuses, this is 1.2, and the thickest I'll use is 1.6. 1.2 is just a little bit above the 0.9, of course, that you would use with MIG welding wire. You don't have to lay all the wire in, you can just drip it in as you need it, so it doesn't really matter the thickness of the wire you're using. And I use a little bit of silicon bronze. Some people are a bit critical of that, I don't really care. The silicon bronze is just to help blend out the weld, so I can see where I'm finishing the surface. I just prefer to do it that way. A lot of people will just leave the welds as they are and just fill them up later on. I mean, that's fine too. There is it's splitting hairs if you're just trying to work out you know, what method is better than the other. Everyone's going to be different. I like to finish things off with a little bit of silicon bronze. That's just me. I know some other people that do this sort of work will do that as well. Okay, so that should hopefully be a wrap for this week. And what will be next? Well, it's a little bit of a tricky question. Maybe we'll attach it to the mudguard. I'm not too sure. I have got a bottom to put on, and that one's had a fair bit of work to turn it from an FB bottom to an FC bottom, but we'll cover that in another episode. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Moments in Metal, and thanks for watching. Catch you next time.